It is August 1945, and Japan stands on the precipice of surrender. The great empire that once commanded vast territories across the Pacific has crumbled beneath the weight of 2 atomic bombs and relentless Allied forces. In the twilight hours of the conflict, a group of Japanese women officers, part of the Imperial Army, are captured by American soldiers. These women, though now prisoners, had once held positions of power and influence within the military hierarchy. Now stripped of rank and forced into the harsh reality of defeat, they stand in the ruins of their world. As they are led into a makeshift camp, the air is thick with tension. They have been trained to expect submission and fear from their enemies, but what happens next is something they could not have anticipated. American soldiers, tall and battle-worn, step aside to allow the women to pass. Then, in a quiet yet profound gesture, the men lower their eyes. It is a subtle, unexpected act of humility. The women, stunned by the gesture, are left in silent disbelief. They have been conditioned to see their captors as beneath them, but here, they are confronted with something entirely different. For the first time in their lives, these women are forced to grapple with the complexities of power, respect, and humility. In this brief, unexpected moment, everything they thought they knew about the enemy is called into question. By 1945, Japan's position in World War II had become untenable. The Allied forces, particularly the United States, had made significant strides across the Pacific, culminating in the devastating bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August. These attacks, combined with the relentless Allied push, broke the Japanese military's resolve. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender, marking the end of the war. At this point, the entire nation was facing the aftermath of its imperial ambitions. Its military infrastructure in ruins and the stark reality of its defeat looming large. However, the surrender also brought with it an unexpected challenge: the Allied occupation of Japan and the complicated dynamics between former enemies. Amid this uncertainty, there existed an equally surprising reality. A small group of Japanese women officers who had served in the Imperial Army, now taken prisoner by American forces. While women in many nations were excluded from military service during the war, Japan was different. In the mid-1930s, the Imperial Japanese Army created the Women's Volunteer Labor Corps, with many women filling roles in auxiliary functions such as nursing, logistics, and communication. As the war intensified and the need for personnel grew, Japan began to utilize women more directly in military operations. While not in combat roles, many women held positions of leadership, particularly within support divisions. Some served as officers overseeing operations related to communication, intelligence, and logistical support. However, despite their authority, their status was often subordinate to that of men, and the women's roles were confined by the rigid gender norms of Japanese society at the time. The notion of women holding military positions in Japan was controversial, as the culture was deeply patriarchal. In Imperial Japan, military leadership was regarded as a distinctly masculine sphere. Yet, as the war escalated, necessity demanded change. Women, many of them highly educated and well-versed in military strategy, found themselves at the forefront of tasks typically assigned to men. Despite their leadership positions, they often worked under the watchful eyes of male superiors who struggled to reconcile the traditional gender hierarchy with the practical need for women in leadership roles during wartime. In the final stages of the war, as the American forces surged into Japan, these female officers found themselves not as victors but as prisoners. The American soldiers, after years of brutal combat with Japan, were tasked with handling the surrender of a nation and the enemy forces left in the wake of that collapse. For the women, their capture represented the final defeat of an empire they had once sworn to defend, and yet this moment, this profound surrender to the enemy, would become a time of reflection and disorientation for both the women and their captors. In Imperial Japan, gender roles were fiercely defined, and women were expected to adhere to a strict set of expectations that dictated behavior, both within and outside of the home. The idea of women participating in military affairs, particularly in positions of power, was a contentious subject. In a society that revered male warriors and the concept of the samurai spirit, the very notion of a female soldier ran counter to centuries of tradition. However, as the war wore on, Japan's need for manpower led to the creation of more complex roles for women. Initially, Women were recruited to assist in the war effort in more traditional capacities such as factory work or nursing. But with the increasing demands of a nation on the brink of collapse, many women were inducted into military service, primarily as officers who would oversee auxiliary roles. The Women's Army Medical Corps and Women's Communications Corps became vital in supporting the war effort, as women worked to maintain logistics and communications, often in regions devastated by Allied bombings. While the role of women in Japan's military was important, their status within the hierarchy remained limited. Female officers were still seen as subordinate to their male counterparts, their authority often undermined by cultural beliefs about gender and the hierarchical nature of Japanese society. Their education and leadership skills were recognized but often overlooked or minimized when compared to the positions of their male peers. Internationally, the idea of women in combat roles, especially as officers, was met with a mixture of surprise and skepticism. In most Allied nations, including the United States, women were relegated to support roles, though they were not excluded from the war effort. The idea that Japanese women could hold positions of authority within the military and actively contribute to wartime strategy and logistics challenged Western perceptions of gender roles in military leadership. In particular, American forces, after years of fighting against the Japanese, had developed a strong, often dehumanizing view of their enemies. To the average American soldier, the idea of a female officer in the Japanese military was a novelty, yet one that also fit within the larger narrative of Japan's militaristic and ultra-nationalist society. The idea that women, once largely relegated to the domestic sphere, were now wielding influence within the military only added another layer of complexity to the image of Japan's war machine. When these women were captured, the expectation from the Japanese side might have been that their captors, hardened by years of brutal combat, would treat them with disdain or even cruelty. However, the reality they encountered was far from what they had anticipated. As they were led into captivity, they found themselves in the presence of American men who, despite the bitterness of war, lowered their eyes in a gesture of respect. This small but profound act of humility challenged everything the women had known about the enemy. For the women who served in Japan's military, the experience of war was shaped by the cultural expectations placed upon them. Raised in a society that revered traditional roles for women, centered around the home and family, many of these women had defied cultural norms to serve in roles traditionally reserved for men. But their service was not without deep internal conflict. Japan's military culture was rigid, steeped in patriarchal traditions, and even though these women were given authority within certain divisions, their leadership often came with limitations. They were not expected to command troops in combat, and the majority of their responsibilities were centered around administrative, logistical, and medical tasks. Yet despite these limitations, many of these women held significant influence within the war effort. They had been trained in military strategy, had overseen communication lines, and were integral to ensuring the operation of critical systems within Japan's wartime infrastructure. In the context of Japanese society, gender roles were deeply entrenched. Women were expected to uphold the ideals of way, harmony, and on-duty, serving the family, the nation, and the emperor in ways that were circumscribed by their gender. Their primary role was to support their male counterparts, whether in the household or in the military. For the women who entered Japan's military during the war, they did so against the backdrop of these deeply ingrained cultural beliefs. The role of women in Japan's military was fundamentally shaped by this tension between the reality of wartime, necessity, and the traditional gender norms. On the one hand, they were encouraged to step into leadership roles out of necessity, driven by the dire circumstances of the war. On the other hand, they were expected to do so with a level of modesty and restraint, avoiding any display of authority that might overstep the boundaries traditionally allowed for women. These women, despite their leadership positions, were still viewed through the lens of traditional Japanese femininity. Their status as officers might have commanded respect in military contexts, but outside of that framework, they were expected to remain humble, subservient to the patriarchy that governed not just society but the military itself. This complex duality shaped their experiences both during and after the war. They were seen as both figures of authority and as women who, in the eyes of some, still had to prove their worth beyond their gender. So, when American soldiers treated them not with the disdain that was typical in wartime dynamics, but with respect by lowering their eyes in deference, it was a cultural shock. In the eyes of the Japanese women, this behavior defied their understanding of their role and the power dynamics that governed their interactions with men. They had been raised in a system that emphasized male dominance and female submission, and here, they were faced with an American gesture that was both unexpected and deeply respectful. In the final stages of World War II, Japan's military was stretched thin. The male soldiers who had once filled the ranks were either dead or in retreat, and the need for manpower became critical. Japan turned to its women, many of whom had previously been relegated to traditional roles, to fill positions that could help the war effort continue. The women who became officers in Japan's military were tasked with managing critical components of the Army's operations. These roles were often not directly involved with combat, but their contributions were nonetheless vital. Some served in communication and intelligence, ensuring that messages were transmitted and that strategic decisions could be coordinated between various divisions. Others were involved in logistics, ensuring that supplies were distributed and that medical care was provided to wounded soldiers. Many women were placed in charge of medical and nursing units, ensuring that the wounded received attention amidst the chaos of battle. Despite the importance of these roles, the women officers faced immense challenges. They were often undermined by their male counterparts, and in some cases their authority was questioned because of their gender. In a society that valued masculinity and military prowess above all else, female leadership was seen as an anomaly. Many of these women had to navigate these cultural barriers while also dealing with the practical difficulties of war. They had to command respect from their subordinates, handle logistical challenges, and make life and death decisions, tasks that required strength and resilience. When these women found themselves prisoners of war, they no longer had the authority they once commanded. The power dynamics shifted completely, and they were no longer in charge. Yet the humility shown by the American soldiers, their respect despite the bitter history between the nations, was a jarring reminder of how far the lines of authority had been blurred. The American soldiers who lowered their eyes were not just offering a gesture of humility. They were recognizing the complexity of the situation, acknowledging the sacrifices made by women in wartime and, in a way, offering respect for the leadership they had once held. For the Japanese women officers, the capture by American forces was both a physical and psychological defeat. These women had been taught to view the Americans as the embodiment of everything their empire sought to destroy. The forces of the West, who embodied the ideals of democracy, individualism, and freedom. They had been raised in an environment where the Japanese were encouraged to believe in their cultural superiority, in the righteousness of their military campaigns, and in the ultimate destiny of their nation. Yet, as they stood in the hands of their captors, these women found themselves confronting a reality they had never expected. The American soldiers who guarded them, though battle-hardened and carrying the weight of a brutal war, did not treat their captives with the hostility and disdain they had been led to expect. Instead, they offered a gesture of respect, lowering their eyes as the women passed by. For the female officers, this act was almost unfathomable. How could the enemy, those they had been taught to despise and fear, show such humility? This moment of unexpected respect was not just a simple gesture. For the Japanese women, it shook the foundation of everything they had believed about the enemy. It was a profound realization that the American soldiers, despite the violence and destruction of the war, still saw them as human beings. In a culture where hierarchy and authority were absolute, where the bond between soldier and emperor was sacred, such an act of deference seemed out of place. But it also opened the door to an uncomfortable truth. Their captors were not the monstrous, faceless enemy they had been conditioned to hate, but men who, despite everything, possessed the capacity for humanity. The gesture was a turning point for these women. It forced them to reconsider not just their perceptions of the enemy, but the nature of power, respect, and leadership. In a world where authority had always been defined by rigid hierarchies, this simple act of humility from the American soldiers challenged the very foundations of their identity as military officers and as women within the context of a patriarchal society. The act of lowering their eyes, an expression of humility and respect from American soldiers. toward their Japanese women captives had a profound psychological impact on the officers. The women, trained to perceive themselves as part of a superior military and culture, were suddenly confronted with the complexity of their own position. No longer in control, no longer in charge, they were left with the uncomfortable realization that their captors were treating them with a level of respect they had never imagined possible. This moment was a psychological dissonance that reverberated through their minds long after the initial surprise wore off. How could the soldiers they had been taught to despise show such kindness? The act left the women questioning their preconceived notions about the enemy, their own roles in the war, and the nature of the power they once wielded. In Japanese culture, humility and respect for others were deeply ingrained values, especially in interactions between those of different ranks or statuses. The idea that an enemy would lower their gaze was not only a sign of respect, it was a recognition of the inherent dignity of the other person. In a culture where the concept of honor was paramount, the act of lowering one's eyes was a powerful demonstration of this respect. For these women, who had been raised in a militaristic culture that demanded absolute respect for authority, the psychological impact of seeing their captors acknowledge them as equals was overwhelming. They were caught in a cognitive dissonance, forced to reconcile their lifelong beliefs with a reality that contradicted everything they had been taught. This profound moment of respect challenged their understanding of the world. It forced them to confront the idea that perhaps the humanity of the American soldiers was greater than their own military leadership had ever allowed them to believe. The decision of American soldiers to lower their eyes in respect toward their Japanese captives was not just a small act of humility, it carried profound moral implications. In a world ravaged by war, where the boundaries of right and wrong had been blurred by years of violence, the capacity for such kindness from the victors was both unexpected and deeply significant. For the American soldiers, the act of lowering their eyes was not just about showing respect to individual captives. It was a gesture rooted in the belief that even in war, dignity should be preserved. These soldiers, who had fought through brutal campaigns in the Pacific, understood the psychological toll of war. They recognized that the women they were now holding as prisoners were not the architects of the empire's destruction. They were simply women caught in the machinery of war, forced to participate in a system much larger than themselves. In a sense, this moment of mutual respect was an acknowledgement of the shared humanity between the soldiers and the officers. It was a recognition that despite the brutalities of war, there was room for decency. For the American soldiers, this simple gesture was a chance to embody the very ideals they had fought to protect during the war. Ideals of freedom, dignity, and respect for others, even in the face of a bitter enemy. For the Japanese women officers, the moral implications of this act were profound. They had been raised in a culture that glorified the emperor and the military, where loyalty to the state was the highest form of duty. To be treated with respect by the American soldiers, their enemies, was a moral shift in perspective. It was a moment that forced them to grapple with their own identity as soldiers, as women, and as members of a defeated empire. They were left to reconsider their role in the war, the choices they had made, and the future that lay ahead. In the quiet of that moment, as the American soldiers lowered their eyes, the lines between captor and captive blurred. It was a moral moment that transcended the war. It was a recognition of the shared humanity of all those involved, regardless of nationality or status. The days following Japan's surrender were filled with uncertainty for both the Japanese women officers and the American soldiers who captured them. These women had spent their careers in the hierarchy of a military system that upheld rigid rules of power, superiority, and control. They had been conditioned to expect submission from those they had conquered, from the civilians of occupied territories to the soldiers they had sent into battle. But now, in the ruins of a broken empire, they found themselves on the other side of that equation. The moment when the American soldiers lowered their eyes marked a profound shift in this power dynamic. At first, the women did not fully comprehend the meaning of the gesture. In the chaos of war, the concept of respect between enemies had rarely, if ever, been afforded to them. But as they walked past their captors, battle-worn, exhausted, yet still holding a strange reverence, something unexpected happened. The soldiers who had spent years fighting against them, witnessing the horrors Japan's military had wrought across the Pacific, now bowed their heads in a gesture of humility. It was not the gesture of an enemy acknowledging defeat, nor was it an act of superiority on the part of the captors. It was a gesture that transcended the military hierarchy and went directly to the heart of human decency. For the first time, the women officers were confronted with a reality they had never known: the idea that their captors saw them as human beings, not as faceless instruments of an enemy regime, but as individuals worthy of dignity. The subtlety of the act, a lowering of the eyes, a quiet acknowledgement, was not grandiose. It was simple, humble, and strikingly profound. For the women, it was a moment that shook their sense of self. Raised in a culture that viewed power as a visible, commanding force, the act of humility by the American soldiers left them stunned. They were used to the language of war, commands, demands, and battles. But this act of lowering one's eyes, the recognition that no matter the circumstances, they were still deserving of respect, left them grappling with an emotional conflict they were not prepared for. This seemingly minor act, a movement of the eyes, became a turning point for the women officers. It was not the physical end of the war, but the psychological shift that would define the rest of their lives. As they processed what had just occurred, they would be forced to reconsider everything they had been taught about their captors, their role in the war, and their very identity. As the women officers walked past the soldiers, their minds were in turmoil. For many, the idea of surrendering to the Americans had been inconceivable just months before. The indoctrination they had undergone in their youth, the teachings of the superiority of the Japanese spirit, and the belief in their country's divine mission had all been shattered with the collapse of the empire. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had brought that collapse to a horrifying and devastating reality. Yet it was not the force of the bomb or the brutality of defeat that impacted them as much as this unexpected act of humility. For the women, this moment was far more than a sign of respect. It was a confrontation with their own identity. They had been trained to view themselves as superior, both because of their status as officers and because of the ideals they had been raised to believe. The imperial system, with its deeply entrenched gender roles and militaristic values, had defined their lives. They had held authority, commanded respect, and operated within a framework that rewarded obedience and submission. But here, in this moment of captivity, they were forced to relinquish their position of power, not just militarily, but psychologically. As they walked past the soldiers who lowered their eyes, they began to question everything they had known. How could the American men whom they had been taught to hate show them such deference? How could those who had fought so brutally against their nation now treat them with respect? The emotional turmoil of this act was compounded by their own internal struggles. They had lived in a world defined by harsh authority, where strength was measured by dominance and power. But now, faced with this simple yet profound act of humility, they were forced to confront a new reality: that respect could be shown in ways that did not involve superiority or strength. This moment of vulnerability, this confrontation with their own feelings of powerlessness, created a lasting emotional impact. For the women, it was a turning point, a moment when the rigid divisions between captor and captive began to blur. They had entered the war believing they were defending their country, their emperor, and their way of life. But now, faced with this simple gesture of humility, they were left to reconcile their role in the war, their actions as military officers, and the human cost of their country's imperial ambitions. The emotional and psychological consequences were profound. For the women who had once commanded respect, this act of humility stripped away their sense of invincibility. They were no longer warriors. They were simply people, standing before men who had fought against their country but were still capable of showing them decency. The aftermath of Japan's surrender was an emotionally turbulent period for the female officers who had been part of the Imperial Army. The experience of captivity, combined with the unexpected gesture of respect shown by the American soldiers, became a defining moment in their lives. These women, who had once been at the helm of the military machine, now found themselves in a position where they were no longer in control. The world they had known, a world shaped by hierarchy, duty, and unwavering nationalism, was gone. In its place stood a humbling reality. The act of lowering their eyes left many of the women officers in a state of internal conflict. Raised in a culture that emphasized the superiority of Japan, They had been conditioned to see the enemy not as human beings, but as obstacles to overcome. Their training had taught them to dehumanize the Allied forces and view them through the lens of the imperial mission. Yet in this moment of captivity, they were forced to confront a new truth. The soldiers they had been taught to hate and fear had shown them an unexpected kindness. They had treated them with respect, even in the midst of their defeat. For many of the women officers, this forced them to confront their own feelings of shame and guilt. They had been part of a system that had perpetuated immense suffering, yet now, as prisoners, they were faced with a reality that challenged everything they had believed. The kindness extended by the Americans was not just an emotional shock, it was a moral reckoning. Could they accept this respect from the very people they had been taught to regard as inferior? Could they reconcile the violence and destruction they had witnessed, with the understanding that their captors too were capable of mercy and dignity? The emotional consequences were long-lasting. For some, the experience of being treated with respect allowed them to begin healing. It was a moment that offered a glimpse of humanity in the wake of war's devastation. For others, it was a painful reminder of the moral compromises they had made during the conflict. The realization that they were now the objects of mercy, rather than authority, forced them to confront their own complicity in a system of violence that had ultimately led to their downfall. In the years that followed, the memory of this moment lingered. For many of these women, it became a pivotal point of reflection. It marked the moment when they stopped seeing their captors as faceless enemies, but as human beings, men who, despite the horrors of war, had the capacity for respect and humility. The impact of the American soldiers' gesture of respect was not just confined to the personal experiences of the Japanese women officers. It also had a broader effect on the post-war occupation of Japan. In the wake of the war, Japan found itself at a crossroads. The country had been utterly defeated, its imperial system dismantled, and its infrastructure in ruins. The task of rebuilding the nation would require not only physical reconstruction, but also a significant cultural and psychological shift. The American-led occupation of Japan, which began shortly after the surrender, sought to reshape the nation's political, social, and economic structures. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of the occupation was the task of fostering a new relationship between the former enemies. Japan had been a militaristic society, and its people had been taught to view the Allies, especially the Americans, as enemies to be defeated at all costs. In the post-war period, there was an effort to deprogram the population from these deeply ingrained beliefs and to instill a new sense of humility and cooperation. The unexpected act of respect shown to the Japanese women officers symbolized this broader shift. It was a small yet significant gesture that transcended the immediate context of war and defeat. It was a recognition that the relationship between the occupiers and the occupied would require not just political and economic change, but a fundamental rethinking of what it meant to treat one another with dignity. For the Japanese women officers, the respect shown by the American soldiers was a moment of personal reconciliation. For the broader population, it represented the possibility of a new relationship between the two nations, one based on mutual respect rather than animosity. The post-war period in Japan was marked by efforts to rebuild the country's social fabric, and the experience of these women officers caught between the remnants of an imperial system and the realities of their captivity became a microcosm of this larger process the American soldiers who had lowered their eyes to. These women were, in many ways, playing a part in a new narrative for Japan. They had taken the first step in what would become a long and difficult journey of reconciliation. The memory of the war and the brutality it had entailed would never fade, but in this moment of humility, both captor and captive were reminded of a fundamental truth, that, even in the aftermath of war, it was possible to find common ground through respect and understanding. The moment of respect, when American soldiers lowered their eyes to the Japanese women officers, was a small, almost imperceptible act, yet it carried profound significance. In the brutal, dehumanizing landscape of war, where survival often meant abandoning empathy for the sake of victory, such gestures can seem rare. Yet in this quiet gesture, humanity's capacity for compassion emerged. For the Japanese women officers, it was a humbling experience, one that shattered the image of the enemy they had been raised to hate and fear. It was a moment of realization. forcing them to confront their own perceptions, their complicity, and the very foundations of the empire they had served. For the American soldiers, it was a powerful affirmation of the ideals they had fought for, a belief that respect for all people, even in times of war, was possible. It was a moment of grace not born from political strategy, but from the understanding that mercy could transcend the boundaries of nationality, race, or history. This simple act of lowering one's eyes held within it the seeds of reconciliation. In a world often defined by the brutality of war, it was a reminder that even in the darkest moments there remains the possibility for mutual respect, even between former enemies. The post-war years in Japan would be marked by a slow but steady rebuilding, both physically and culturally. The scars of the conflict would not disappear overnight, but this act of humility from the American soldiers planted the seed for a new, more complex relationship between the United States and Japan, one built not just on the ashes of war, but on the shared human understanding that, despite the damage and division, we are all capable of kindness. For the women who had served as officers, this moment marked a turning point. It was a gesture they would carry with them for the rest of their lives, a moment when the cruelty of war was softened by the simple dignity of respect. In the years that followed, they would rebuild their lives, reflect on their experiences, and find ways to reconcile their roles in a nation now in ruins. But no matter the distance they traveled from that moment, it would remain a reminder that even in war, moments of humanity could shine through, transforming enemies into fellow human beings, capable of understanding and compassion. This quiet act, small as it was in the grand arc of history, reminds us that there are always possibilities for reconciliation, even after the harshest of conflicts. It is through respect, through recognizing the shared dignity of every individual, that we begin to heal, both as individuals and as nations. And in doing so, we move beyond the wounds of war, toward a future where understanding can replace hatred and mercy can become the path to lasting peace.